Apple recently announced that they're closing iTunes, and this made a huge splash with news and with a lot of talking heads that were trying to get their head around what happens to iTunes. How are we going to listen to music? How are we going to download music? What's going to happen to everything that we bought in the past? But the honest truth is that Apple is not getting rid of iTunes. They're rebranding iTunes. So now Apple Music will be different from Apple Podcast and Apple Movies and whatever else they come up with. So iTunes is not going anywhere. iTunes will just simply be one part of a larger media environment. iTunes came out in 2001. At that time, it was just kind of the parallel to Windows Media Player, but for Apple technology. iTunes Store launched in April of 2003. And in April 2003, that's when you could start purchasing 99-cent downloads of individual songs. At the moment that Apple launched the iTunes Store, this was a kind of watershed moment in the music industry. At the time, Napster had really reinvented the way that we consume music. In 1999, when Napster launched, it became the first moment where people could freely find music online. There were other stores around at that time. One that I can think of is mp3.com. And these different outlets, you could purchase music, mp3.com, you could download, and they would send a CD to you in the mail. It was mainly independent artists. But at that time, there wasn't really any music that you could get from the major record labels that was in fact what they considered legitimate. So if you wanted your music at the time, you could take a CD, rip it onto your computer, and do whatever you wanted to with those music files. So people started distributing them through Napster. Of course, the Recording Industry Association of America killed Napster in 2000, 2001, but different file sharing sites kept popping up. Eventually, the recording industry recognized they needed to do something to meet consumers for what they wanted. And the way they did that was they started having conversations with Steve Jobs. Now, a lot of people in the recording industry make Steve Jobs seem almost like a pariah, that he did this thing to the recording industry. But the major record labels all cut a deal that they would get licensed so much money for different downloads. And in April of 2003, the iTunes stores launched. Now, right around that time is when file sharing, or the Recording Industry Association of America started suing individual file sharers. So in, I believe it was September of 2003, that's when the lawsuits against individuals happened. So the attempt to shut down file sharing moved to consumers, and iTunes was envisioned as this legitimate way for people to get digital music files. The rebranding of iTunes was just a rebranding. It became obsolete because a lot of other services, whether it's Google or Microsoft, they all have different apps that you can use for the different media that you might listen to music, listen to podcasts, watch videos. They all had these different apps. iTunes, pretty much everything came through iTunes. So a lot of techies were deriding Apple for at one time being this really sleek and fancy thing. Now it had become really bulky. So Apple felt behind time, so they ended up rebranding it and breaking the different parts apart. However, while they did do that, I really think the discussion of iTunes closing was a public relations stunt to get people talking about the Apple conference that they had coming up the following week after their announcement. So it was a really lackluster announcement for this kind of conference. They basically announced, in addition to iTunes, they had a really expensive computer monitor that probably nobody will buy, and they had like dark mode for their iPhone, which my Samsung phone I'm pretty sure already had.